The indentured servants from the Forth have given me more troubles than any men I ever received from England. Their constant at sea has been on the whole extremely troublesome indeed, and disorderly in every way. There are, of course, exceptions, but on the whole never did men bring worse characters, and they landed in the worst possible tempers. I have had infinite troubles in housing, with double the numbers of people I expected, and was thankful that others had run away to make room for them. That was Chief Agent for the Van Diemen's Land Company, Edward Curr, complaining about workers who had arrived in his establishment in Circular Head on the ship the Forth in 1832. Circular Head is modern-day Stanley, right up there in the northwest of Tasmania, and Curr was writing his tirade to John Curr, the managing agent of the VDL Company in Hobart. The arriving indentured servants on the Forth and Curr did not get off to a good start. Curr was not a happy chappy. In fact, he spent years battling the unhappy indentured workers, even saying that he much preferred the convict labour he was given to help build the work and settlements in the northwest of Tasmania than the free people who came out from England. But then the indentured servants didn't much like him either. So much so that many of them preferred to risk the dangerous trek of more than 200 kilometres through virgin bush, crossing swollen rivers, just to get to Launceston and away from Curr and Circular Head. But if they thought traversing the Tassie wilderness would be the end of it, well, then they didn't know Edward Curr very well. Let's hear all about this battle between the absconders and the VDL Company in today's episode of Ratbags and Roustabouts. As ever, I'm your host, Marion Langford. Of course, Tasmania is now a tourist hotspot, boasting gorgeous untouched landscapes, amazing flora and fauna, and it's a foodie paradise. And Stanley, right up there in the top left corner, has all of the above. In the water, there are scallops, crayfish and giant crabs. At night, you can go and see the fairy penguins jump over the rocks as they shelter along the coastline. And the whole town is built around the base of the famous Stanley Nut, a 143-metre-high bluff made up of volcanic rock jutting out into the freezing waters of Bass Strait. I remember going to Stanley as a girl back in the 80s, before anyone on the mainland knew anything about it, and the wind cut right through you as you watched the crazy few ride the chairlift to the top of the Nut. I was there again last year, and the wind was still there, so was the Nut. In fact, not much was all that different, except now there are maybe a few more tourists and the odd film scout. If you've ever seen the movie The Light Between Oceans starring Michael Fassbender, then you've already been to Stanley and that wild west corner of Tassie around Circular Head. Nowadays it feels fairly remote, but for the British inhabitants in the early 1800s, when they already thought they were at the absolute end of the world, being in Van Diemen's Land, to then go to the most remote settlement on the island would have been very, very isolated. So let's get into the story of how this town was even established and that whole kerfuffle between Edward Curr and the indentured servants who were employed to build his vision. This whole story begins with sheep, merino sheep to be precise. By the late 1700s, merinos were doing well up in Sydney. We've all heard the phrase, Australia was built on the sheep's back, and you're probably aware of John MacArthur in particular, who was one of the merino pioneers up in Sydney. And so, in 1824, a group of men met in London to discuss the idea of a large-scale merino operation in Van Diemen's Land. It all sounds a little clandestine, but at the time, the wool prices were very high, so if they could create a huge and constant supply of fine-grade wool from Britain's colonies, especially if the wool could be produced cheaply using convict labour, then they could undercut the competition, guarantee supply, and see some big profits. A couple of these men had spent time in Van Diemen's Land, and they'd seen the land, they'd seen other small operations doing quite well with sheep, and they were of the opinion that the Lieutenant Governor could be persuaded to grant a sizable parcel of this lush, fertile land over to them. And so the group of wool traders formed the Van Diemen's Land Company. First order of business was putting in an application for land, and they didn't hold back. They asked for 500,000 acres. Just for comparison, that's only a little bit smaller than the size of the Australian Capital Territory, the ACT. That wasn't all. They wanted that land to be in the north of the island, and they wanted at least 2/3 of it to fall east of the Western Tiers. Essentially, they wanted it more in the top right of the island, east of Launceston, and down and across as far as Oyster Bay. But that was not to be. A new Lieutenant Governor was sent to rule Van Diemen's Land in 1824, our old friend George Arthur. You will remember him from his ongoing feud with bushranger Matthew Brady back in episode 2 of Ratbags. If you haven't listened to that one yet, check it out, it's a great episode. Anyway, Arthur, even though he's barely set foot on the island, let alone toured the districts, immediately says, "Nah, don't go east. That big bit in the northwest, that's what you want. It's going to have some great land, perfect for sheep." And at the same time, yes, it seems 1824 was a pretty big year, a young chap called Edward Curr published a book. It was called An Account of the Colony of Van Diemen's Land, principally designed for the use of emigrants. Now, I've quoted briefly from this book before. In it, Curr talks about how he doesn't like the shaggy gum trees on the island and recommends anyone emigrating should bring some good old English tree saplings out with them. But there must have been enough good stuff in the book to encourage the newly formed VDL company that it was the right move to make, even if the governor was only going to grant them land in an area of the island that was a complete unknown literally to everyone involved. I mean, it's a little bit like during COVID when there were people buying houses interstate sight unseen, though even then they had photos and video walkthroughs to help them. For the new VDL company, it seems like a pretty big thing to take such a gamble on. But in for a penny, in for a pound. I guess once they'd made the decision, they figured it absolutely couldn't fail, right? We will see. And look, they did do a small amount of due diligence. They contacted Curr to pick his brain about Van Diemen's Land and see what he thought. He told them the east was good. He didn't know much about the west, but similar to Governor Arthur, he said it's bound to have some good land based on what is everywhere else. And the directors were so impressed by Curr, who at this point was just 26 years old, that they offered him the job of managing the settlement for them, giving him the title of chief agent. So they put in the formal application for the land in the northwest. But by now, everyone had talked it up so much that the government thought they should hold a bit back. The island was only so big, they wanted some land for the other settlers, and they also didn't want one company to hold quite so much sway in the colony. So they put on a few stipulations. The area of land was to form a square in the northwest of the island, and they were only permitted 250,000 acres of usable land. Everyone agreed to this. The deal was done. They began exploring the area, and the beginning of many disputes between the colonial government and the VDL company began at this point. But during this time, they also found what they thought was the best harbour on the coast, which was at Circular Head, which also happened to have a large amount of open grassland around it, so that was a good place for them to set up their operations. To work these sheep stations and to clear the land and build houses, in particular Curr's grand residence of Highfield House that the ambitious young man thought was only fitting for him to raise his growing family in, they were using a mixture of convict labour and indentured servants. The convict labour was easy. The VDL company would literally put in their request to the government for what they wanted, say 2 sawyers, a farmhand and a shoemaker, for example, and boom, they'd find some men who could do those jobs and send them across. In fact, there's one request I found where Curr asked for a bird stuffer. I assume that's a taxidermist. I'm not entirely sure how vital to operations a taxidermist was. But anyway, when it came to indentured servants, though, agents of the company would trawl through the English countryside, hand-picking people with skills that were needed. They would then put forward their offer. You work for us for 7 years, sometimes this was less, and we will organise the passage out to Van Diemen's Land for you and your family. You get paid £20 a year with rations and housing provided. If we have need of work from your wife or your kids, they were putting boys to work at the age of 10, then we'll pay them wages as well. Then, at the end of your indenture, you're free to take up land of your own on the island. For many they approached, it seemed like a pretty good deal. Once people did the sums, between them, I can earn £20, my wife can work, my, 2 kids can work. It could tot up to quite a sizable annual household income. One of the people they approached was a bloke called John Cross. He was the same age as Edward Curr. He was a stonemason and bricklayer from the village of Tingewick in Buckinghamshire, and he is my 3rd great-grandfather. He was good at his job. He came from a family of stonemasons and bricklayers, and they used the Flemish style of laying the bricks, to the point where if you walk around Tingewick now, you can actually tell which houses were built by the Cross family by the brickwork. Anyway, with the promise of a solid future for his growing family in a new land, John agreed to take this VDL company up on its offer, and he bundled his wife Fanny and 5 of their children into the Forth to sail away to the edge of the known world. Which brings us nicely back to the Forth's arrival at Circular Head, about which Curr wrote that the indentured servants from the Forth have given me more troubles than any men I ever received from England. So what went so wrong with this ship in particular? Well, here's the other side of the story, shown in a brief report in the Independent newspaper on April 14, 1832. The barque Forth, Captain Robertson, landed 50 individuals at Circular Head for the VDL Company. In this number are included shepherds, carpenters, etc., together with their wives and families. On their arrival, they were landed in the course of the day, but in the evening they were returned to the ship, there not being accommodation on shore. A philanthropic gentleman on board the Forth, discriminating among the number, a man and his wife, as he thought more intelligent than the rest, engaged to pay their passage money from Britain, provided Mr. Curr would forego their engagement. The offer was accepted, and these 2 useful individuals are added to our community. Now, I don't know who the philanthropic gentleman and his wife were who were mentioned in that article, but they probably dodged a bullet there. For the rest of them, though, who no doubt would have had nowhere near enough funds to pay for their passage, they didn't have a lot of choice. But still, they were not happy. Essentially, what happened was this. When they arrived and all piled off the ship, they were confronted with a ramshackle collection of a few houses with so many leaks in the roofs you may as well be standing outside, and tents that did very little to protect you from that constant wind, the cold, and the rain. So they took one look at this situation and said, yeah, nah, and they went straight back to the ship. Then they refused to get off the ship until things had improved. Now, as we heard in that letter that Curr wrote, he said more people turned up than he'd expected. I am not sure how that's entirely possible, but anyway, he said that meant finding accommodations were tricky. But for all the people on the ship who had presumably left perfectly good homes back in England, probably with fully functioning roofs too, as well as fireplaces and beds and doors, who'd been promised accommodation, being given a leaky tent after 4 months or so at sea, I'd be pretty angry as well. Curr went back and forth from the ship trying to calm the new batch of indentured servants down, but let's just say people skills were not among his forte. Later, in the same letter, he says, "What the cause of it may have been, I scarcely know." In that letter, he does actually mention one of the men by name, and that is my ancestor John Cross. He writes, The Reverend Mr. Palmer's men are amongst the best conducted. Cross fully maintains his good character. All agree that the allowances of spirits has been one main cause of the troubles. Yes, as usual, he blames the devil drink, hard liquor, not the fact that you've given your workers less than ideal houses and tents for them to work in so that they can work dawn to dusk building you your grand house. But this does give us a nice little insight into Edward Curr's character, because this whole episode is very indicative of who he was as a man. So let's hear more about him. Curr was born in Sheffield in 1798, the son of a civil engineer. His dad actually managed the Duke of Norfolk's coal mines in Sheffield, but Edward wasn't interested in following his dad into that business. He preferred to experience a bit of adventure, which is what he got when he landed a job working for a London merchant. He'd married well, his wife came with a nice sizable dowry, so he never had to worry too much about money. That said, though, he was your typical Yorkshireman who counted every penny and always held everyone he dealt with to account for everything they owed, as we'll find out a bit later. And look, I am allowed to say that about people from Yorkshire because my husband is a Yorkshireman, and I think the last time he opened his wallet, I saw a couple of moths fly out. I did actually consider getting him to record the quotes from Curr for this podcast, but, well, look, I barely understand the man, so to be honest, it's probably better if I read them out. Anyway, the merchant Curr got the job with was heading off to Van Diemen's Land, and so Curr and his wife went along as well, arriving in Hobart Town in 1820. He was friendly with Lieutenant Governor William Sorrell. He was given a land grant. He travelled around. Then in 1823, his father died, and he went back to England with his wife and 2.5 sons. His third was born on the voyage back. And it was at this time, on the ship going back, he was bored. He thought, you know what, I'm going to write a book so that people who are going out to Van Diemen's Land have a bit more knowledge than I did. And that's what he did. And that, of course, is the book that I've talked about before, which the VDL company read, and that's how they got in touch with Curr. And when you read this book, you can pretty easily, I think, see the kind of man Curr was. He really told it like it was. He believed in earning your way in the world. He believed in hard work, and he believed hard work got just rewards. And for those who didn't put in the graft, they didn't deserve to get anything back. For example, this is how he describes a typical Van Diemen's Land farmhouse. The cottage is usually built of sods, logs or mud and thatched with straw. A few logs laid together in the style of the American fence perhaps compose a pigsty, and an open detached yard of the same materials serves to contain the working cattle. These are, in a majority of cases, the only features of a farmhouse in Van Diemen's Land, unless indeed we think proper to add the disgusting appearance of wool, bones, sheepskins, wasted manure, and the confused heaps of ploughs, harrows, carts, firewood and water casks, with a few quarters of mutton or kangaroo hanging on a neighbouring tree, and a numerous tribe of dogs and idlers, the former barking, the latter lounging about. Everything betokens waste and disorder, the total absence of industry and economy. He doesn't have very nice things to say about the convicts, though clearly later on he changes his tune about that one when he realises he likes the indentured servants even less. But in the book, this next quote pretty much sums up his feelings about the place. Alas, with all its inviting beauties, its riches and its verdure, it is still Van Diemen's Land, still the abode of felons, a moral evil. Were Van Diemen's Land free from the evil I now describe, though it would diminish its riches, it would be capable of being rendered one of the most delightful countries on the earth. Curr was single-minded, stubborn, pig-headed and litigious. He was a big man, 6'1" or 185 centimetres tall, and by the time he was 40, he weighed around 110 kilos. He had a large, square, determined jaw. He commanded every room, every meeting. You'd find yourself seeking his approval and then hating yourself for it. He imposed his will on everyone he met, and to be honest, he was pretty much a hard man to like. But then he wasn't there to make friends, he was there to get a job done. The problem was, it wasn't just the workers who he pissed off. It was the settlers, it was the newspapers, it was his bosses, and it was the government as well. So let's return to 1832. Eventually Curr did manage to get everyone off the Forth and get them to start working. But it was an uneasy relationship. Previous to the Forth's arrival, Curr had already had trouble with some of the indentured workers absconding from the settlement. I've managed to find names for at least 6 men who had run away before the arrival of the Forth. But why? They've got work, they have an albeit leaky roof over their heads, they have food, and once they get through the next few years, they'll be able to get their own land grant and could end up doing quite well. Part of the issue was that the indentured servants were treated pretty much the same as the convict workers, and they did not like that. They're working side by side, doing the same hours, eating the same rations, living in the same damp and cold houses. And when problems crop up, the convicts are lashed, they have their wages docked, everyone gets punished. Van Diemen's Land in the early 1800s has a feeling of lawlessness about it. The police are mostly former convicts, there's corruption in the ranks, there's the isolation and the distance that makes it hard to seek justice, so a lot of infractions just go unpunished. But it's almost the opposite at Circular Head. Curr runs a tight ship, and he is the one who is a justice of the peace, so he is the one who is the area's magistrate, which means Curr is the law, and he's not afraid to mete out punishment. Now, when the settlement was in its early days, Curr was pretty happy with the general behaviour. He wrote in 1827, "Drunkenness is unknown, robbery is rare and confined to petty thefts committed by one prisoner or another. We have no absentees nor runaways." But 5 years later, that situation is a different kettle of fish. Now, it seems Curr is surrounded by complaints. It was written into the contracts of the indentured servants that any justice of the peace may punish a violation of their indentures, and Curr is the only justice of the peace. But the conflict here, obviously, is that most of the problems they're having are caused by Curr, so they really had nowhere to go, no recourse at all. It's not a fair judicial system by any means. In fact, at this time, Curr authorised twice as much punishment as anyone else in the colony. Another issue was that the indentured servants soon found out that the wages they were earning were quite a bit below what they could earn elsewhere in Van Diemen's Land. They hadn't been aware of the average wages when they'd agreed to come, but now they feel like they've been tricked and trapped and kind of cheated into signing these contracts. And then there was the work that they were being asked to do. While they were making do in less than ideal accommodations, the main construction they were involved in was building the grand residence of Highfield House for Curr and his family to live in. It's still there, it's a beautiful building, and it's now a historic site open to the public. I was there last year, and of course, by the time I was leaving, I'd worked out that the woman working there was my cousin. Anyway, if you're ever in the area, you really should go and have a look through. But really, for the workers back when it was being built, how would that feel, trudging up this steep hill every day to build this huge grand home for your boss, and then trudging back down the hill in the dark to your freezing kind of lean-to? In 1833, there was a description of this marked difference when Curr finally got a police magistrate to come to Circular Head, which is something I'm going to talk a bit more about later. But just listen to this report talking about Highfield House compared to the house given to this new magistrate. "A fine building is erecting at Highfield as a dwelling for the resident agent. We trust also that a respectable residence will be erected forthwith for the accommodation of the police magistrate. Mr. Horn and family, we regret to learn, being at present very indifferently protected from the weather. The hut which they inhabit consists, we hear, of only 2 rooms, and the ceiling of one of them was so imperfectly finished as to fall down on the whole family while sitting under it. Mrs. Horn was much stunned by the blow, but not otherwise, we are glad to say, seriously injured." It was certainly a good way for Curr to build up a lot of resentment among everyone else who lived there and worked for him. So, as an indentured servant, what do you do in that situation? You either knuckle down, bite your tongue and count down the days until the end of your contract, or you say, blow this and get out of Dodge. And that's what people started to do. In all my research, and honestly with this subject, I have trawled through pages and pages of reports and letters and court cases and books and who knows what else. I only found one description of what the absconding indentured servants endured in their escape for freedom. This is third hand, but it does sound like a pretty traumatic journey. It was in the early springtime when the party set out. The snows were melting and the rivers were running full. Little did they anticipate the suffering and difficulties awaiting them. One very great trouble to them was in making fires. The weather was cold, and in getting along through the scrub and swimming the rivers, they were nearly always wet through. Fire was in those days obtained by means of a flint and steel and tinder, which was difficult to keep dry. They experienced great difficulty in crossing the Inglis River, having to wait till the floodwater subsided, adding a week to their journey. They all began to feel the effects of the cold and wet, and worse than all, they began to run short of provisions. The journey being such a rough one, and having so many rivers to cross, each man could only carry a very limited supply of rations. However, after 8 days of hardships, they reached Emu Bay. So they'd heard that there was a track that struck off at Emu Bay, but it was very hard to see, and the group spent another 8 days just looking for it. The description goes on. They wandered about trying to get the track in a most exhausted condition, living most of the time on shellfish taken off the beach and a kind of cress they found in a creek. So during this time, it says they encountered a group of 3 Indigenous men who looked as scared of them as they were. They had no food, they were cold and exhausted, and began to seriously wonder what the hell they'd done, when by sheer good luck, they ran into someone they knew. Now, this account gives the person's name as Robson, and I'm fairly sure this was George Robson, who ran the operation for the video company at Surrey Hills. To be fair to Robson, he didn't stop the men from their plan to leave, but the first thing they did was kill his dog and eat it because they were so hungry. Apparently, they started eyeing off his horse as well, and he's like, no. Hang on, let's think about this for a minute. We need the horse. I'll take you back to Surrey Hills and I'll sort you out. But of course, when they got to Surrey Hills, they hadn't eaten for so long, and then they overate, and 2 of the men actually died because they got so sick from overeating. The rest of them were sick for days, and they had to stay there until they were well enough to move on. But eventually they did. They crossed more rivers, more hills, and finally got to their destination of Longford, just south of Launceston. Now, I've driven from Longford to Stanley. It takes about 2.5 hours these days by car. It is about 220 kilometres, but in those days, add in the fact that there are no roads, no tracks, you're not even sure if you're going in the right direction, you're freezing and wet and starving. I mean, how miserable must you have been to endure all that just to get away from it? But Curr was absolutely ropeable about the situation. He became completely obsessed with the whole issue of the absconders. It didn't help that it was ruled in court that the contracts that the indentured servants had been made to sign were actually null and void. That meant that the only legal recourse open to Curr was to sue these men for the cost of their passage out to England. So he's trying to do that. Meanwhile, he's also talking to George Arthur to get the government to pass a bill that will close this legal loophole and make the contracts binding. Throughout 1832, he wrote a series of letters to the Van Diemen's Land Company solicitor, George Cartwright, of increasing urgency. In June, he writes a long, slightly rambling letter outlining every legal avenue that he thinks should be explored. He talks about the non-binding contracts. He names the 2 absconders who he thinks have the most money, suggesting that they should pursue them first as they're the most likely to settle out of court. But then partway through the letter, he changes his mind about that. Instead, he thinks that they should leave those wealthier men alone and they should go after the poorer ones so that when they can't pay their debts, they'll be put in prison, and that will serve as a stronger message to the indentured servants still back at Circular Head to stop them from absconding. Towards the end, he writes this: "If you have to go into court and are successful, it is desirable that you should act with severity. It is not a case of common debt, but of gross injustice on the part of the men. This justifies severity on our part, whilst it is necessary also to deter others." I mean, this is not just a man wanting to recoup a debt. This is a personal vendetta. Curr feels deeply injured by these men who didn't meet their end of the bargain. The irony is that he believes that hard work brings success and these men are lazy, and yet he's making them build his house for him. I mean, yes, he is working, but God almighty, he's not even picking up a hammer. I might be doing him a slight disservice here, but it does seem slightly hypocritical that on the one hand he's demanding these men work dawn till dusk to build him this beautiful house, while he can't find the funds to stop their roofs falling in on top of their heads. Meanwhile, more men have absconded as the year goes on, and Curr feels like he's hitting his head against a brick wall. He has no answer at all from George Cartwright after multiple letters. George Arthur won't do anything about making the contracts binding. His court cases are not going well. His next obsession has been trying to get a police magistrate who's based at Circular Head. But Arthur says that if he wants that, then Curr has to pay for the magistrate's accommodation and pay for part of his salary, which Curr greatly objects to. Then in September, 4 more servants abscond. This includes, despite his apparent good character, the stonemason John Cross. Curr writes yet another desperate and pleading letter to Cartwright. "Since I had the honour to see you in Hobart Town, I have written you 4 very urgent letters on the subject of the indentured servants absconded from the company, and deeply as this subject affects our interests, and much as I have urged you, I have not been able to extract a single line from you in answer. In the meantime, the evil which timely communication from you might have enabled me to check goes on increasing. Our men are fully assured that there is nothing to hold them except the difficulty of the journey to the settled districts, and now they go when it suits them. Once gone, I know very well it will be impossible to get them back." The thing is, no one was on Curr's side. He was just shouting into those howling bastrate winds. Curr got on quite well with Governor Sorrell in those early days when he was tramping around the island, but he doesn't have the same easy relationship with George Arthur. The other free settlers in the north of Tassie aren't fans of the VDL company either. A newspaper article in 1830 has some strong opinions on the idea, mooted by the company, of selling its produce to the local free settlers, saying that they are the ones who should be buying produce from the settlers, not selling to them. It says this: "Is this fulfilling the expectations which were raised on the first establishment of the company? Is this benefiting the colony? We answer no. It is the reverse. It is coming with more powerful hands and shoving us from our stools." Meanwhile, in the courts, the name of the VDL company is being dragged through the mud. In a trial of the Van Diemen's Land Company versus Hay, Miller and Neal, Mr. Justice Montague says this: "This seems to come out in a very disgraceful way as the instrument of a large company. I must say that these poor and not unlikely illiterate men have been grievously used in the making of this contract. It appears to me as inflicting a great degree of hardship on them." It's probably these men who another newspaper report refers to being immured in jail, pointing out the absurdity of keeping workers in prison because they owe you a debt, which they clearly can't pay until they're out of prison and able to earn money working. And through all of this, the more Curr fought the issue, the more the VDL company bosses took notice, and the more unhappy they became with Curr. And nothing made them more irritated by Edward Curr than his own obsession and anger over the issue of the police magistrate. In 1832, with indentured servants running out on Curr left, right and centre, he asked Governor Arthur for a magistrate to be based at Circular Head. Arthur agrees, only if Curr provides his accommodation and pays part of his salary. Curr labels this an unfair tax on the company, but eventually he grudgingly agrees and Alfred Horn is sent. That's the man whose wife had the ceiling fall on her head. But then in 1835, the magistrate was changed to Dr. John Hutchinson. Curr did not approve of him as a choice of magistrate, and so he refused to pay for him. Of course, as with everything around Curr, this ended up in court as the government tried to make him stump up for the bill. But Curr just dug his heels in. He said dignity would not allow him to do so. He thought the colonial government had it in for him, which possibly they did, but he just got more and more hostile and aggressive. Well, this was just too much for the VDL company bosses. Curr was an embarrassment. Everyone hated him. Plus, the merino sheep had been a complete failure. The ground was too wet, the weather too extreme, and they were dropping like flies. Those that weren't dying from the conditions were being picked off by animals, Tasmanian tigers. Then the wool that actually managed to be packaged up and sent to England hadn't been washed and sorted properly. Look, while a VDL company wasn't going to completely shut up shop, the situation with Curr, that had reached breaking point. It was time for him to go. In September 1840, they gave him his 12 months' notice. And in July the following year, the Colonial Times called him the great potentate of the North. Potentate means autocrat or monarch, and it went on in an exultory tone. We understand the high and mighty has fallen. He has been relieved from his high puissance and called home to give an account of his stewardship. Curr relocated his family to Melbourne and did what he did best over there, cause trouble. He had a fight in a police station over his cook. He wrote angry letters. He published angry pamphlets. He ran for the Legislative Council, lost, but caused so much trouble in the meantime through the election campaign that the guy who beat him promptly resigned and they had to hold the election again, with Curr then refusing to run a second time. He spent most of his energy during these years fighting tooth and nail for the separation of Victoria from New South Wales, something which was finally achieved on the 11th of November 1850. Curr died just 5 days later at the age of 52. His wife and 11 children survived him. Over on the other side of Bass Strait, what happened to my ancestor John Cross and his family? Well, after only putting up with 6 months at Circular Head, he got his family away and they resettled in Launceston. John found work as a stonemason and he and Fanny had 4 more children, one of whom was my second great-grandfather. But on the 25th of June 1840, with his youngest child just 1 year old, John died of fever. He was only 42 years old. Still, if you go to Highfield House at Stanley, what forms its foundations? What lines its walls? Well, even now, they're the bricks made and laid by John Cross, his legacy as solid there as that of his former master, Edward Curr. And speaking of Curr, let's end with these words from him, who I can only assume spent the rest of his days still seething at those indentured servants who dared take matters into their own hands. I can only at present repeat that the indentured servants are the greatest torment we are afflicted with, and my full conviction is that it is impossible to develop any mode of treating them which will induce them to do their duty to their master. The evil is a very great one indeed. Well, that's it for today, folks. The feud between Curr and the absconders. When Edward Curr got into a fight, he was like a dog with a bone. He just wouldn't let it go. And in the end, it cost him his position and soured his reputation. And this story is a pretty good example why industrial rights are important, because you shouldn't let that big guy push you around. You should always stand up for what's owed to you. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed hearing all about the Van Diemen's Land Company and the absconders. Don't forget to head over to the website ratbagsandroustabouts.com to read the show notes. There's also another little extra story in there today about emus, of all things. You'll also find links to things like Edward Curr's letters if you really want to spend half your life, like me, trying to make out his scrawling script. I've also popped on there a link to Curr's book if you want some light, unintentionally amusing reading. And don't forget, if you like podcasts on YouTube, you can now find Ratbags and Roustabouts over there as well. Plus, of course, you can follow me on Instagram too. As usual, I'll be back in a fortnight's time for more stories of those common as muck ratbags and roustabouts from our past who still have extraordinary tales to tell.